There are men who are not born for themselves. They are born for others, born for the moment when everyone else steps back and someone must step forward. And Michael Stone was one of those men. He did not choose this quality. He did not learn it from any book. It was simply in him, the way roots are in the earth, deep, quiet, and unbreakable. In the year 1968, in a small town called Macon in the state of Georgia, America, a boy was born and his name was Michael Stone. His father, Robert Stone, worked the land from morning until evening, calloused hands and a quiet heart. And his mother, Eleanor Stone, was a schoolteacher who believed that the greatest thing a mother could give her child was not money or comfort, but a sense of purpose. The family was not wealthy, but the house was full of warmth, and from the very beginning Michael was different from the other children around him. When other boys ran away from trouble, Michael walked toward it. When a smaller child was pushed down in the schoolyard, Michael was the one who reached down and lifted him up. When a neighbor's barn caught fire one summer night and everyone stood watching from a safe distance, it was 12-year-old Michael who ran toward the burning building to pull out the animals trapped inside. And when his father grabbed him afterward and said, "Michael, you could have been killed," Michael looked up at him with steady eyes and said, "That, Father, someone had to go, and no one else was moving." His father held him for a long time that night and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. His son had already understood something that most men spend their whole lives trying to learn. School passed, and Michael grew into a quiet, strong young man. Not loud, not boastful, the kind of person who spoke less and did more. In 1986, at the age of 18, Michael walked into a United States Army recruitment office in Macon and signed his name. His mother, Eleanor, stood at the front door of their house the morning he left, her hands folded, her eyes steady, and she watched him walk down the road with his bag over his shoulder. And Michael turned around one last time and smiled and waved, and Eleanor raised her hand and waved back, and she did not cry until he had turned the corner and could no longer see her. And then she sat down on the porch steps and wept quietly, not from weakness, but from the weight of knowing who her son was and what that would one day cost him. Training was brutal, but Michael was made for it. He was the first one up every morning before the bugle sounded, and the last one to sleep every night. He ran faster than the others, carried more weight than the others, complained less than all of them. And his commanding officer, Sergeant Donald Hayes, pulled him aside after the third week of training and said, "Stone, I have trained hundreds of men in my years, and I am telling you that you have something in you that cannot be built in a training camp. It has to be born." And Michael asked quietly what it was, and Sergeant Hayes said, "Calmness under fire. The ability to think clearly when everything around you is chaos." And Michael was silent for a moment and then said, "Sir, I think it is simply that when something important needs to be done, I stop thinking about myself." And Sergeant Hayes looked at him for a long time and then nodded slowly and said, "Yes, Stone, yes, that is exactly it." The years passed and Michael served with discipline and dedication, earning the respect of every man who served alongside him. Then, in the summer of 1990, the world changed. On the 2nd of August, 1990, the forces of Saddam Hussein poured across the border into Kuwait, a small, peaceful nation that had no chance against such power. Within hours, Kuwait City had fallen. The images that reached the world were devastating. Civilians running, buildings burning, a small country being swallowed whole. The United Nations condemned the invasion. America and its allies began gathering their forces, and in January 1991, one of the largest military coalitions in history launched Operation Desert Storm to drive the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Michael Stone was 32 years old when his unit, the 24th Infantry Division, crossed into the desert theater. He had served for 5 years by then, was respected by his peers and his commanders alike, and he carried with him the same quiet steadiness he had carried all his life. The desert was unlike anything he had trained for. The heat was a living thing, pressing down on a man from above and rising up from the sand below. The wind carried grit that worked its way into everything, and the silence between gunfire was somehow more terrifying than the gunfire itself, because in the silence you did not know where death was coming from. In his unit was a young soldier named Carlos Rivera, 20 years old, from a small town outside San Antonio, Texas. Carlos was brave enough, but he was young and far from home, and some nights Michael would find him sitting alone, staring at a photograph of his mother and younger sister. And Michael would sit down beside him without being asked, and they would talk. And one night, Carlos said that, "Michael, I am scared. Not of dying, but of dying without having done anything that mattered." And Michael was quiet for a moment, and then said that, "Carlos, every morning you wake up and put on that uniform and go out into that desert, you are doing something that matters." And Carlos said, "But what if it is not enough?" And Michael said, "Then when the moment comes, you will do more." And Carlos nodded and said, "How will I know when the moment comes?" And Michael smiled and said, "You will know. Everyone knows. The question is only whether you move or stay still." The ground offensive began on the 24th of February, 1991, and it was ferocious and fast. The coalition forces moved through the desert with overwhelming power. Iraqi defenses crumbled, soldiers surrendered by the thousands, and within days it was clear that the liberation of Kuwait was nearly complete. But the final days of a war are often its most dangerous, because a retreating army is a desperate army, and desperate men do desperate things. It was the 27th of February, 1991, one day before the ceasefire would be declared, and Michael's unit was pushing through the desert south of Kuwait City when the radio crackled with an urgent transmission. A convoy of civilian vehicles, families who had been hiding in the outskirts of the city, elderly men and women, mothers with children, people who had survived months of occupation and were now trying to reach safety, had taken a wrong road in the chaos of the liberation and driven directly into the path of a large column of retreating Iraqi soldiers who were moving fast, heavily armed, and shooting at anything that moved in front of them. The civilians were trapped at a desert crossroads approximately 2 kilometers ahead of Michael's position. The Iraqi column was closing on that crossroads from the north. If they reached it before the civilians could be pulled back, the outcome would be catastrophic. The commanding officer's voice came over the radio, sharp and urgent. Someone needed to reach that crossroads ahead of the Iraqi column and hold them back, buy time, slow them down long enough for the civilians to be guided to safety. But the crossroads sat in the open desert, flat, exposed, nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover. Anyone who went there would be standing in the open against a column of soldiers with tanks and heavy weapons. The radio went silent. Michael's unit stood in the sand and no one spoke. Every man understood what was being asked. Every man also understood what it would cost. The desert wind moved through them and still no one moved. Eyes down, boots in the sand, the silence heavy as stone. And then one pair of boots moved. Michael Stone stepped forward, checked his rifle, filled every pocket of his vest with ammunition magazines, picked up his radio, and without a word, turned and began walking toward the crossroads. Carlos grabbed his arm with both hands and said, "Michael, no, this is not a mission. This is a death sentence. Please." And Michael stopped and turned around and looked at Carlos with those calm, steady eyes that had never changed since he was a boy in Georgia. And he put one hand on Carlos's shoulder and said, "Rivera, you are a good soldier and a good man. And one day you are going to go home to San Antonio and live a long life. And that is exactly what you are going to do." And Carlos's eyes filled with tears, and he said, "Michael, please." And Michael said, "Someone has to, Carlos. You know that. Someone always has to." And he pulled Carlos into a brief embrace and then turned and walked into the desert alone. He reached the crossroads with minutes to spare. In the distance to the north, he could already see the dust rising from the approaching Iraqi column. Vehicles, soldiers, moving fast. Behind him, to the south, he could hear the engines of the civilian convoy, still trying to turn around on the narrow desert road, the process agonizingly slow. Michael took the only cover available, a small ridge of sand and rock no more than half a meter high, lay behind it, steadied his rifle, and waited. The Iraqi column came into range. Michael fired his first shot. The lead vehicle jerked and stopped. The column halted in confusion. For 30 seconds, there was silence as the Iraqis tried to understand what was happening. Who was shooting? How many? From where? Then they opened fire. The desert erupted. Bullets tore through the sand around Michael from every direction, throwing up small explosions of grit and dust. The noise was deafening, and Michael pressed himself flat and kept firing. Methodical, controlled, one shot at a time, the way Sergeant Hayes had trained him a decade ago. A bullet tore through the sand centimeters from his face. Another struck the rock beside his hand and sent fragments cutting across his knuckles. He kept firing. The Iraqi column tried to advance. Michael's fire pushed them back. They tried to flank left. Michael repositioned and pushed them back again. His shoulder was burning. A bullet had caught the edge of it, not deep, but enough to make his arm tremble, and he switched the rifle to his other hand and kept firing. Over the radio, Carlos's voice came through, broken with static and emotion. "Michael, the civilians are moving. They are turning around. Just hold on. Please, just hold on." Michael pressed his back against the sand ridge, reloaded, caught his breath for 3 seconds, and went back to firing. 1 minute passed. Then another. The Iraqi column was spreading out now, trying to surround the crossroads, and Michael knew what that meant. He kept firing. His ammunition was running low. His arm was shaking. His breath was coming in short bursts, but he did not move from his position. Then Carlos's voice came over the radio one final time, and it was not a soldier's voice anymore. It was a young man from Texas who was crying in the middle of a desert war, and he said, "Michael, they are safe, all of them, every single one. They are safe. Please come back, please." Michael Stone looked up at the sky above the desert of Kuwait, pale blue and endless, and silent above all the noise below. And his mother Eleanor's face came to him as clearly as if she were standing right there. Her hands, her eyes, her voice, the morning he left, saying, "Michael, come home." And he smiled, and he whispered very quietly, "Someone had to, Mama. Someone always has to." He was found at the crossroads when the dust settled. He had not moved from his position. 47 civilians reached safety that day, 23 adults and 24 children, because one man stood alone in the open desert and held the line until they were clear. When the war ended and Carlos Rivera came home to San Antonio, he did not go to his own house first. He drove to Macon, Georgia, and he knocked on the door of a small house on a quiet street. And when Eleanor Stone opened the door and saw Carlos standing there alone, with red eyes and his hat in his hands, she understood everything without a single word being spoken. She stepped back slowly and sat down in the chair by the window, and Carlos sat on the floor at her feet, the way a child sits, and he told her everything, every detail, every minute, the crossroads, the desert, the radio, the last words, the smile. Eleanor Stone listened without interrupting. When Carlos finished, she was quiet for a very long time. The house was completely still. Then she raised her eyes, and Carlos saw that they were full of tears, but also full of something else, something that was not grief, something that was stronger than grief. And she said, "I knew. From the morning he walked down that road and turned to wave at me, I knew he would not come back." Carlos could not speak. After a moment, he asked, "Then why did you never try to stop him? Why did you let him go?" Eleanor looked at him steadily and said, "Because that is what I raised him to be. And a mother who raises her son to be good must also be brave enough to let him be good, even when it costs everything." Today, in the desert south of Kuwait City, near the place where a small crossroads once sat in the open sand, a memorial stone has been placed by the people of Kuwait. On it is carved one name, Michael Stone, Georgia, USA, 1968 to 1991. And beneath the name, just one line, "He stood alone in the open desert so that others could walk free." The children of Kuwait are told his story in their schools. They are told that on the last day of a terrible war, when everyone else was still, one man moved forward. They are told that he was not a general or a commander. He was a farmer's son from Georgia who simply believed that someone always has to. And they are told that his name was Michael Stone. Friends, the world does not always remember the names of those who saved it, but the desert remembers, the sand remembers, and the 47 people who walked away from that crossroads remember, and their children remember, and their children's children will remember, because the name of sacrifice never truly dies. It only passes from one generation to the next, carried forward like a torch in the dark, never going out.
Born of Georgia, clay and sun, he learned the quiet work was never done. He found his ground in Kuwait's open wide, where 47 souls had nowhere left to hide. He stood alone, a silent creed. He stood alone so others could proceed.